This is Christopher Sernaque, hosting episode 5 of season 1 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Hopefully you have received your Valentine's Day gift by now, but if not, you have a gift from the planet, or as some say, dwarf planet, Pluto. In the year 2015, NASA's interplanetary space probe, New Horizons, discovered something fascinating about Pluto in its flyby. Apparently, Pluto has a heart. This heart is actually a heart-shaped region on the planet Pluto. This region is called Tambori Regio and is also known as the heart. Pluto's heart was not the only thing that surprised NASA researchers. In fact, Pluto's unique landscape had plains, canyons, geysers, mountains, and more. Dr. Bertrand, a postdoctoral research fellow at NASA, had his expectations subverted by Pluto's landscape. He said, "You have to imagine that everybody expected a flat ball covered with ice," end quote. Dr. Bertrand and his co-authors had a paper published this month in the AGU Journal of Geophysical Research called "Pluto's Beating Heart Regulates the Atmospheric Circulation, Results from High-Resolution and Multi-Year Numerical Climate Simulations." This paper outlines how the west lobe of the heart-shaped region controls Pluto's winds. The eastern part of the lobe has both gaunt mountains and a plain. This plain is frozen nitrogen that pulses, like a heartbeat if you will, and it makes the winds flow westward. On the daylight portion of Pluto, the nitrogen ice begins to warm and thus turns into vapor. This creates pressure and in turn causes the nitrogen vapor to flow towards the colder and darker regions where it reforms as ice. This process, according to Danielle Venton, creates a flow from the north to south and back, end quote. Because Pluto is spinning towards the east, the rotation deflects the winds and in turn causes them to flow in a westward direction. NASA discovered this heartbeat cycle on Pluto when they applied weather forecast models that were made for Earth. Pluto's heartbeat and unique features are remarkable. Upon seeing the New Horizon images of Pluto, scientist Alan Stern asked, "Who would have expected this kind of complexity?" End quote. Mike Wall, writing for Space.com, commented that the surface of Pluto is every bit as complex as that of Mars, end quote. Pluto's features also indicate that the planet is young. Let's consider Pluto's orbit. According to a Scientific American paper called "God Takes a Nap," Pluto's orbit would be chaotic on a 20 million year timescale and would affect the rest of the solar system, which would likewise become unstable over that same timescale, indicating that Pluto must be younger than 4.6 billion years in age. According to Nadia Drake, writing for National Geographic, Pluto's surface looks young, end quote. In her article called "First Pluto Flyby Pictures Are Complicated and Fascinating," Drake wrote that Pluto's landscape looks relatively young, so young in fact that it suggests the planet is still geologically active, end quote. Science Daily records the words of the New Horizons geologist who stated, "The discovery of vast, craterless, very young plains on Pluto exceeds all pre-flyby expectations," end quote. The reason why the pre-flyby expectations were exceeded is because the data requires Pluto to still be, or to have recently been, geologically active. This presents a problem for the idea that Pluto is 4.6 billion years in age. Pluto, especially when compared to the size of the other planets in the solar system, is relatively small and would have cooled off rapidly after its origin as outlined in the nebular theory. Therefore, Pluto cannot be 4.6 billion years old and is far younger. Furthermore, according to the secular model of the solar system, Pluto has been battered by objects in the Kuiper Belt for billions of years. NASA scientist John Spencer said that because there was not a single impact crater found on Pluto's southeast quadrant, that this means this is a very young surface, end quote. Besides the lack of craters, Pluto's mountains of ice suggest that the planet is young because if Pluto truly was 4.6 billion years in age, it would no longer have enough energy to continue to push up these young mountains. Additionally, Pluto has low gravity. In fact, Pluto's gravity is only about 7% of the Earth's. Because of Pluto's low gravity and the ultraviolet light of the sun, hundreds of tons of Pluto's atmospheric nitrogen escape into space hourly. If Pluto really were 4.6 billion years old, its atmosphere would have already dissipated. Pluto's features defy an age of 4.6 billion years and are consistent with the Bible's timeline of about 6,000 years. Finally, as we explored in the first episode of the Current Topics in Science podcast, there are many problems with what is called the nebular hypothesis or the nebular theory. For those not familiar with the nebular theory, it is the idea that the solar system formed from a cloud of gas and dust 4.5 to 4.6 billion years ago, all rotating in the same direction. Pluto and its moons pose several problems for the nebular hypothesis. For instance, only one of Pluto's moons, Charon, is gravitationally locked to Pluto. Pluto's other 4 moons rotate much like spinning tops, and Pluto's moon Nix is rotating backwards and on its side. Furthermore, Pluto orbits at an angle of 17 degrees instead of in the same ecliptic as the other planets. Moreover, Pluto's rotation axis is not perpendicular to its orbital plane. Instead, it is tilted in such a way that one pole points almost directly at the sun. By the same token, Pluto's orbit is more elliptical than circular, so much so that for 20 of the 248 Earth years its orbit takes, it actually comes closer to the sun than Neptune is at some points. To return to Pluto's 5 moons, all of them rotate at different speeds as they orbit Pluto. Each of these facts are problems for the nebular theory that have not been resolved. However, these facts are not a problem if Pluto is only about 6,000 years old and was created by an act of God. In today's episode of Current Topics in Science, we found that young Pluto has a heartbeat and that each of us are dear to the heart of God. Thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on Current Topics in Science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.